Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Q&A show, Monday Night Live. And we are having a special tonight. We've got Dr. Grady McMurtry, who will be speaking to us all the way from Florida in the USA. But meanwhile, let me just introduce my wife, who's very kindly offered to come out this very late hour, as it is. We are broadcasting from Spain. Thank you, Leslie.
You're welcome.
And what are you going to be doing here tonight?
I am in charge of the emails, so do get your emails in. And I'll be very, very happy to read your questions to Grady and, of course, your comments. And it's been a few weeks, actually, since Dr. Grady's been with us.
Right.
And we're really looking forward to this.
You could actually swap places. You know, Grady could read the emails and you could answer all the very important questions.
I'll have to go to the Grady School of Learning first.
Okay. Anyway, all the numbers and contact details will be on your screen throughout the program. Also remember that Dr. Grady McMurtry has a website, and we haven't got the strap working tonight, but it's creationworldview.org, creationworldview.org, where you'll find loads of information and something that you would like to give to perhaps your children, to be able to give an answer to why we have a different viewpoint to the world, because we look at what the Bible says with regards to creation, and also what Christ had to say about it speaks volumes to me and reassures me that we're a young earth and not millions of years old. I might look a million years old, but Dr. Grady is quite a youngster, at least by 3 months. Good evening, Dr. Grady.
Yes. I am 3 months younger, but I turned a year older on Friday last week. So.
Yeah, but you're now 74?
Yes, sir.
That's right. Well, we're doing great. We're both 74, not out, and we're here just trying to serve those who want to know the truth about God, about His will and purposes, and about some of the things that He did right in the beginning, particularly in the book of Genesis. Now, Dr. Grady, because you're in what I would call Trump land in Florida,
yes.
Give us your take on what is happening with regards to the coronavirus over there in Florida. I mean, we get some mixed messages here, and I would say that perhaps because we're speaking from Europe, we're very much more, if you like, enamored, might be the wrong word, but you know what I mean, with regards to the safety precautions of taking, for example, a mask everywhere you go, and also being very particular and careful when we go shopping or whatever. We do seem to stick by the rules of our governments, whereas perhaps in Florida, Trumpland, you'd be a little bit more freer with your social distancing and perhaps wearing masks?
Oh, we're definitely freer. And our governor, DeSantis, a Republican, very much in the vein of Trump, has opened Florida up, not 100%, but almost 100%. Masks are only required in those stores who they themselves require it. Social distancing is practiced, but a little bit looser. But I go into a lot of stores without a mask on. Now, the fact of the matter is, of course, the things that politicians are trying to do are the worst possible answer to COVID. If you took a biblical standpoint, of course, the Bible says that you quarantine the sick, you do not quarantine the healthy. And we see, of course, that the lockdown is quarantining the healthy.
Right, but what are the stats actually showing? Let's take America as a whole. What are they actually saying with regards to the spread of the virus and the pandemic in itself? Is it not hurting you? I mean, you've got high numbers, surely, of deaths and those catching the virus.
If you take a look at the numbers, I entitled my last newsletter, Numbers Matter, a takeoff on another political spin. But numbers matter. And what's happening is the manipulation of numbers. There's an old saying that goes, figures can lie and liars can figure.
Say that again, because it cut off.
Figures lie.
The old adage that figures can lie and liars can figure.
Okay.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And what's happening is a manipulation of the numbers for a political agenda. The fact of the matter is, we shouldn't even be discussing the number of cases that are being found each day, because as long as you test, you'll find more. The only important number really is the number of deaths. And the problem with that is that our Center for Disease Control, about a month ago, put out a report saying that although 250,000 people had died and had COVID at the time of death, that only 6% had died from COVID only. That 2.6% or 2.6, I'm sorry, mitigating circumstances for people who were coded with COVID had 3 mitigating circumstances, which means basically that about 55% of the people who were coded with COVID had died from something else, one of the 3 other reasons, or a mixture, and that the others had died with 2. Now, if you'll take the numbers of the 250,000, multiply it by 6%, you get around, let's say, 14,000. And so that's the actual number of deaths from COVID only. Now, we've lost more people to flu, and we have an immunity shot for that. We have an immunity shot for it every year. But we lose 50,000 people a year due to flu. COVID is nothing by comparison, and yet we have shut down the world's economy.
What about the vaccine? What would you say? Will you take the vaccine, Dr. Grady?
I believe that I would. We, of course, had a very interesting announcement this morning that Moderna has just come out with a vaccine that's roughly 95% effective.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remember that the flu vaccine is only about 50% effective. And so we now have 2 vaccines that are being touted by 2 major companies with Pfizer and Moderna that are 90 and 95% effective. Now, of course, that'll take a while to come out. The healthcare workers and first responders will get it first, no doubt. Then we'll be dealing with the elderly population that are most at risk, and then it'll go into the general population. But of course, your chances of dying from COVID under 65 are really quite small to begin with. So starting with those first is a very reasonable thing to do.
Let me ask you a question, which I know a lot of people would like to hear your point of view, and that is, what do the vaccines contain that that people are talking about with regards to being something quite horrendous, like bits of aborted babies and things like this, and that are put in these vaccines? I mean, surely that's just poppycock.
Some vaccines don't use those things, some do, but you have to remember that any tissue that came from an aborted baby was decades ago. These are stem cell lines that are relatively ancient, so to speak. Now, there's, of course, the bioethical problems that are involved here, but we are using tissue that is so old that there's no bioethical problem at this point.
Right. So, for example, what Leslie's asked you, let me ask you again, you would take the vaccine for coronavirus or COVID-19?
As far as I know, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that's good to hear, because there are people, who will be in a bit of a quandary, especially those in the Christian communities across the world, because there's so much, fake news, to use a very familiar phrase of Mr. Trump's, out there.
There's fake news and there's fake science.
Yes. So how do we determine what is truth when it comes to serious matters like this?
Again, you need to get away from the politicians. You need to get away from the scientists who have a political agenda. For instance, it's been proven that Dr. Fauci, who was a big voice for the last 8 months or so,
mm-hmm.
Has decidedly leftist views. But even today, he started recanting on some of the things that he'd said recently. Now, again, I want to stress, if we were aborting babies today to produce the vaccines that are coming out today, there would be a bioethical problem. But we're not. The various what are called stem lines that are being used for testing initially and so forth are in many cases decades old, some of them 40 years old. No babies being aborted at this time to produce these things. Uh, and this is why I say at this point in time, there's no bioethical problem that exists.
Okay. So that particular rumor, did it have legs and did it have any validity at one point in time, though?
Again, if you were to go back 40 years ago, one might make that argument.
Okay.
But again, I stress that there are many, many new standards, qualifications, laws that have been written that prevent this sort of thing happening. And these major pharmaceutical companies will not risk breaking those laws.
All right. Good. Good to hear that. Have we
Okay,
got
let
any
me
emails?
start with Q&A. Here we go. Mike, you're going to start the evening for us. Hi, Dr. Grady. If the way that... Hang on, which camera am I looking at?
You're the one with the
There
white
you go.
piece in
Sorry,
front
Dr.
of it.
Grady, I'm in a different seat. Right. If the way that the orbits of planets indicate a purposeful design, do galaxies also demonstrate a purposeful design in the way that they operate in some way, says Mike. Did you understand that, Dr. Grady?
Well, basically, yes, but I'll go back to the Bible first, that the heavens declare the glory of God. That we see features, galaxies, orbits, planets, moons, asteroids, etc., all of which show purposeful design and all of which show that we started perfect 6,000 years ago. And because of human sin, the entire universe became imperfect and is literally running down, breaking down. Things are getting worse, not better, the exact opposite of what evolution would claim. And so what we see in astronomy is very vindicating, I should say, of a young creation that occurred only 6,000 years ago.
Okay, right. Next one from Tony. He says, it's been said many a time that when Christians go to heaven, they will see their Christian parents. But the question is, will I see my mother and father as my actual mother and father, or will they be like angels and not our parents? Or will we be all the same, in other words?
First of all, I'd like to clarify something. The Bible does not say that when we die and go to heaven, we will be angels. That is a totally false concept. Angels are supernatural beings created by God with a purpose, but they are less than human. And we do not become angels. We need to clarify that very quickly. Secondly, the Bible doesn't tell us a great deal about heaven, but it does tell us that we will recognize each other. Now, how that's going to be, I don't know. I haven't been there yet.
That's a good answer.
It's amazing how many people, though, do think that when people actually go from this life that they end up being an angel, but of course that's not. I'm glad you clarified that. Lots of things that we need to know from the Bible tonight. Please give us your email or text your message or question in whilst we've got Dr. Grady live here on Monday evening.
Okay, so Dave says, hi folk.
Can I clarify just one quick thing?
Please do.
Remember, Jesus said that when we die and go to heaven, we will not be married, but we'll recognize who our wife was, our children, our parents. And he said that when you go to heaven, you're going to be like the angels, neither married nor given in marriage. But the word like doesn't mean equal.
Right.
It means similar to the fact that angels don't reproduce. And when we're in heaven, we're not going to be reproducing. Mm-hmm. But we are not going to be angels.
And whilst you're talking of angels, Dr. Grady, let me ask you to clarify the different types of angels and perhaps their roles.
There are several different kinds of angels that are described in the Bible. Seraphim, cherubim, there are archangel. So there is an order. There are different kinds that have different purposes. I think we could spend a whole program on that, but just to simply say, Howard, you're absolutely correct. And people need to read the Bible to determine what each of these does.
Thank you.
Okay, let me just go back to my next one from Dave. And he says, hi folks, a while ago you said that no one inland would have had a boat to be saved. Granted, But what about people that live by the sea? Oh, he's talking about Noah here. What about the fishermen living by the coast? They would have had boats. Noah could not have been the only one that was saved. The ark could not have been the only boat. Mind you, I don't know if all those other little fishing boats would have had all of those supplies to last for 40 days, but it's your question, Grady, not mine.
Well said.
First of all, the ark was designed by God not for maneuverability, but survivability. It was huge. You know, we're talking about a vessel roughly 450 feet or more long, roughly 75 or more foot wide, 50 feet high roughly. It was the perfect and most stable floating vessel ever built by man. The fishermen would never have survived. First of all, in the 40 days and 40 nights at the beginning of the flood, tremendous waves, tremendous rain, tremendous storm processes, they would never have been able to survive that. But remember that the flood also lasted an entire year, although the water actually went up and down over a period of 300 days. It was more than a year from the time the flood began to the time they walked out of it. But no one with any kind of a ship, boat, whatever, before the flood would have survived unless they were inside the ark.
I mean, the size of it, we've just got it on the screen now, Grady. You can see the size is bigger than a football pitch, which is very important to the British, by the way. And you can see the measurements there.
And again, the only vessel designed by God, and he was the one who had to design it so that it would survive. No human could have designed it. No human would have had the supernatural knowledge necessary to know all the things that a perfect marine architect, God is, would have known.
Fascinating.
And we will see in a minute just what you were talking about with regards to the waves. We might find that animation as well here. You could see that you would have been tossed around if you were just on a little shipping vessel, because the fountains of the deep opened up, as you said, and the amount of water that came up from underneath the surface of the earth was far greater than what the rain produced.
We have to remember that basically a mile-thick layer of water came up from below at the time of the flood. There's tremendous violence on the surface, and that during the middle of the flood, the highest piece of ground was covered by at least 7 cubits, or at least 21.5 feet of water. That's recorded in Genesis, but also in Psalm 104, the water was covering the mountains. And there's simply no way that anybody outside the ark could have survived.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, moving on. Let's say good evening to you, Joan and Stan. It says, can you tell us, when did the Arctic and Antarctic freeze over, and what is really making them melt?
Well, the idea that the ice caps are melting is an evolutionary concept that goes along with the supposed global warming, but as I have pointed out, the Earth has been in the process of cooling for better than 20 years now. We have been in a severe solar minimum this last cycle, though there has been a little more sunspot activity in the last month. Today there was 0 sunspots. Now, in the question about the polar ice caps, they formed after the flood of Noah due to the events that were experienced at the beginning of the flood. So at the beginning of the flood, we had a mile-thick layer of water coming up from below. That water was 900 degrees Fahrenheit, mixing with the warm seas that already existed. Now, the water, when it comes up at 900 degrees, because of expansion cooling, would have cooled fairly quickly, but nonetheless, we're adding a lot of hot water to already warm water. That water is going to then evaporate quickly, because the warmer the water, the faster the evaporation.
Correct.
At the same time, once the earth cracks open, as we produced a DVD with Revelation called The Waters Cleaved, starts at Caesarea Philippi, goes down the Jordan River, down the Red Sea, into the Indian Ocean, and around the world. The volcanic activity that starts at the time of the flood produces thousands of volcanoes, many of them underwater, but many above. And the ash from the volcanoes will circle the earth, shading the earth, causing the sunlight heat to be reflected back into space, cooling the atmosphere quickly. And so we have the perfect conditions to build polar ice caps. Now, the book of Job is the first book in the Bible to mention ice and snow, and is written roughly 350 years after the flood. And there are several references to ice and snow in Job, most of them in chapters 37 and 38. But the Ice Age lasted for about 700 years, peaked to approximately 500 years after the flood, waned for about 200. That's our best numbers that we can give you. But the polar ice caps did not exist before the flood. They are created again after the flood. Because of the events that initiated the flood, we have the perfect conditions. And it was not instantaneous. It's a slow process of building for about 500 and waning for about 2. Now, the polar ice caps covered much lower. I was just going to say the polar ice caps covered a much larger area than today, but after the Ice Age shrank back to approximately where they are today. Yeah. And the evolutionary story of the polar ice caps melting, there is certainly evidence that there's melting, but there's also evidence that there's accumulation at the same time. So you will hear both sides of that story.
Yeah. Interesting you should mention Job there, because in chapter 37, verses 9, it starts off, it does mention, just as you say, I've never noticed that before, Grady, thank you. It says, out of the south comes the storm, and out of the north the cold. From the breath of God, ice is made, and the expanse of the waters is frozen. Okay. And also with moisture, he loads the thick cloud. He disperses the cloud with his lightning, etc.
Well, verse 22 in Job 38.
Yeah.
The storehouses of the snow, the storehouses of the hail, talking about cold temperatures and ice.
Yeah, that's it. You've entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of distress? Well, thank you again. Next question, Donna.
Okay, let's say good evening to you, Peter. And he says, did Jesus have brothers? And if so, who were they?
Oh, Jesus had half-brothers. And he had half-sisters. If you'll take a look at the Gospel of John, and I'll just pull it up in my Bible here quickly. The Gospel of John, please turn to chapter 7 in John. In John chapter 7, Jesus is in Nazareth. He's at home, basically in the Galilee, as it's put in verse 1. But John chapter 7, verse 1, Jesus was walking in Galilee, unwilling to walk in Judea, meaning in the south, because the Jews, referring to the Pharisees, Sadducees, were hunting him. In verse 2, it's the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, which means it's the fall of the year. In verse 3, his brothers therefore said to him, depart. Now, his brothers are mentioned. You can also take a look at Matthew 15, verses 55 to 56. But James, who wrote the book of James in the New Testament, is his half-brother and was the head of the church in Jerusalem after the crucifixion. But James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas are his 4 brothers mentioned in the Bible, and he had half-sisters as well. As is common in the scripture, though, women are not always named, but they are mentioned.
Okay, Paul says, with regard to COVID, why is it that the flu vaccine in the past have only been 40% on average effective, and yet we're being told that the new COVID vaccines are 90% effective?
Well, first of all, they are not the same strains, and they mutate at different rates. And so the common flu strains mutate much faster. That's why we get only 40-50% effectiveness. That's why the shots that are given are only working on 2 or 3 of the most common strains each year. COVID is mutating much slower, although it does mutate. And the coronaviruses have a slightly different genetic makeup, so to speak, than the regular flu strains. And so that's why the difference.
So with the flu strains, it's a bit of a hit and miss when they aim to actually try and coin the market, as it were, of a vaccine?
Yes, think about what happens. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, and of course that's Europe, UK, States, Canada, What we're doing is we're testing the flu strains that are occurring in, for instance, the Orient, in China particularly, in what is their spring and summer,
Mm-hmm.
to develop the vaccines, the immunization shots, really, that we use in the fall here. So they're 6 months ahead of us,
Mm-hmm.
and so we're using what's happening down there 6 months ahead of time to develop the strains that we're going to consider to be the most dangerous. And so we picked the 2 or 3 strains that are most common this year. We get our immunization shot for that. We take it in our fall to protect us during our winter. But of course, by spring, it wears off. It's only good for about 6 months.
Mm.
And because the mutations are occurring in the Orient, they're developing new strains, which again, we go through the same process every year.
It's interesting you should say that, because just suddenly the penny dropped. That is it every year the same, that they're all originating in the Orient, and that we're having to battle through because they're somehow doing something wrong with creating these viruses in the first place?
Well, first of all, the viruses themselves can be quite natural. Let's not say they're all made in a lab. Now, we can argue about COVID-19, but the fact of the matter is natural flus do exist. And of course, there's the bird flu and H1N1 and other flus that we've had in the past, the Spanish flu, erroneously named, but historically significant back in 1917, 1918. These are natural flu strains. They weren't created in a lab. And the thing is that they mutate very quickly. Now, we are only taking advantage of the natural timing. So flu is most common, colds are most common in the wintertime. So we want protection in the winter. Well, for us to get protection in the winter, we're taking a look at what is happening in the southern hemisphere a half a year earlier in the sense of seasonals.
Mm-hmm.
So we have chickens, believe it or not, mostly chickens, but we have chickens in pens out in the Orient. We see what's happening with mosquito transmissions and other kinds of transmissions. And in their spring and their summer, we're taking a look at what's becoming common. And then we're fighting it here and immunizing in the fall. Right. And it's just a matter of timing.
Yeah, I get that. But the thing is, what I'm also trying to get at is that if the Chinese, because of the way that they mess, if you want to call it that, with their foods and mix and eat, bats and all sorts of other creepy crawlies that, really are not kosher, they actually... destroying their own environment, but also at the same time we're at risk because we're picking up the pieces because they're not kosher.
Well, again, I completely agree with you. I was born in Chinatown in San Francisco, and as I have told people, the Chinese will eat anything that moves.
Right.
Or
dead.
Out of necessity. But the fact of the matter is they do eat things that ought not to be. And there are a lot of diseases and sicknesses that people have gotten by doing things such as eating fruit bats.
Yeah.
Fruit bats, the largest bat in the world, are large enough that they can produce enough meat to be eaten like rats and chickens.
Yeah.
And so they do contain some very nasty things. You should never touch them, but they are eaten nonetheless in Chinese cultures.
Right.
But it's true of other things as well.
Okay.
Okay, moving on. Amanda's letting us know that she's watching, and she said, I just thought I'd email to say thank you for everything you and your team at Revelation do for us all. Oh, Amanda, that's lovely. Amanda. Thank you. Trevor says, can I ask, why do you believe that God does not intervene now in what is a broken world, a world full of pain and suffering? God has witnessed his people suffer beyond comprehension.
Yep. Good question.
It's the kind of question that we've answered before. This one might be worded slightly differently, but again, there are reasons for this. Without adversity, without something to struggle against, we would become weak. And God is not looking for easy believism. Now, many of the things that we are suffering from in the world today are simply the result of initial human sin in the garden and the deterioration of the universe, the natural processes that are breaking down. God cannot reverse that, because if he did, he'd have to say that there's no effect of sin.
Mm-hmm.
But there is an effect of sin, and everything breaks down over time. Again, if I could promise somebody as a missionary, which I am, that if you became a Christian, everything would go well for the rest of your life, I could get 100,000 conversions very easily. But God is not looking for easy believism. So why does he allow Satan to do things? He allows it so that we would have something to resist against, to keep us strong, to love God for who he is, not what he does for us, even though we love him and he will do things for us. But we would love him only because of the good things he does, would be the wrong motivation.
Mm. I would like, I know I've said it before as well, but I'll say it again for any new viewers, is that I really think that God's timing in our eyes is so different that it's not a long period of time that's allowed this period of suffering to be just a matter of days in his sight, but it will come to an end. He will bring all sickness and disease and even death itself to an end, if you read in Revelation chapter 21. And there is tremendous hope for an amazing future where the world will be free of all the sicknesses and diseases, and also all the problems that wicked men, if I may put it like that, are perpetrating and, you know, just prolonging miserable lives for many of us, and that will change.
And if you take a look at Psalm 90, there are 8 great creation psalms. In Psalm 90, he says, 1,000 years to God is no different than 4 hours in the night.
There you go. See? Mm-hmm. And also the Psalm 37 was something that helped me as a young, a 16 or 15-year-old when I was at school, knowing that the wicked will be cut off one day, just a little while longer, and there will be no more. And then we'll have that wonderful promise of God that we will live in an eternal state, which will be perfect.
Okay, I'll read out Irene's email, although you have answered it, because she just says, it's so lovely to see you, Dr. Grady. It's always nice to have you on, as I enjoy the way you answer the viewers' questions. Her question is, what do you think about the vaccine? And I think you have gone through that, and you think that you probably would have the vaccine.
Yes.
Okay, I've got one here from John. Says, wonderful to see Dr. Grady on the show tonight. With regard to my NIV Bible, it says Mark 16, verses 6 to 20 were not in the original manuscript. Does this mean that there is some doubt as to whether this scripture should be included in our Bible?
It appears to have been added, not in the oldest of the manuscripts. But what's important here is the difference, shall we say, between the Greek manuscripts and the Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts in the way in which they were preserved. Under Judaism, the Old Testament was preserved in a superb way. The Greek texts were not preserved in the same scribal way. However, when you do have a point such as this one, we have to take a look and say, yes, it appears to have been added, not in the original, the oldest manuscripts. However, it changes nothing in Scripture. And that's the important thing to remember, that whether it was in the original or not, whether it was added later or not, it does not cause any discrepancy. It doesn't change any teaching of the church.
Can we actually read that out? Because was it Mark 16?
6 to 20. Let me just have a look here.
So the viewers...
Mark 16, verses 6 to 20.
Right. Okay. So there's quite a lot there of the New Testament. It says, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here." Well, as you say, if it's along those lines, it doesn't make any difference if somebody says that it was added at a later stage.
Right. It's argued, admittedly, but it doesn't change anything. It's consistent with the Scripture.
That's another Gospels.
It is in multiple older, not the oldest, but it's in multiple Greek texts that came after.
Okay.
It was perhaps added, but it changes nothing in Scripture.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
Okay, next one. Dr. Grady, what do you think is more complex or amazing? The microscopic world that is not visible to natural eyesight, or the visible creation, the earth and the universe?
Frankly, I think both ends are pretty amazing. I did an article on that one time about the microscopic and the macroscopic universe. We only see, it's like our vision. We only see a very short segment of the spectrum of electromagnetic activity. And the Bible talks about that, that we see darkly now, but then we will see perhaps the whole spectrum later.
Mm-hmm.
There are insects and so forth that can see into the infrared or into the ultraviolet that we can't even see. And there is a world that you could see if you could, that we don't now. But the same thing is true, whether it's at the microscopic level, where you cannot see the complexity of the cells without a microscope and even an electron microscope, or whether you're taking a look at the macroscopic of the entire universe as a whole, we only see a small band in between the two. And the fact of it is, both ends are incredible.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. Tony says, is God's name Jehovah, or is that false? A couple at my door informed me that this was the case, but I was not 100% sure.
Howard, I want to defer in a second. Would you consider that to be a Jehovah's Witness question?
Yes and no, because the thing is that, the term Jehovah actually came in about the 12th or 13th century by a Jesuit priest, I think, that term. But Yahweh is closer, isn't it? With the Tetragrammaton, which is YHWH.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, yes, the name Jehovah itself was an invention, but using the older language. I personally don't see any problem with using it, just as the name Jesus is pronounced differently in many different languages. Isa, Yesu, Yeshua.
It's an interesting
these
point.
are still names of God.
Yeah. But I must admit, apparently originally the term for God, his name, even written in the Tetragrammaton as it would have been, because the vowels are always put in Hebrew, by the reader, is that why was it taken out, from the original scripts? What's your point of view on that?
First of all, in Hebrew there are no vowels.
Exactly.
And therefore, when we say Yahweh, nobody actually knows how to pronounce it correctly, because it became such a revered name that for centuries no one was allowed to pronounce it.
Yes, it's just a consonant.
And so the actual correct pronunciation is unknown. So even when we use Yahweh, we don't know whether we're saying it correctly or not.
Mm-hmm.
And the first name of God revealed in the Bible to us is Elohim.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So there are over 100 different names for God. I have no problem saying Jehovah. However, I admit that it was made up from ancient terminology. Yeshua, Jesus, and of course the Jews revered Yahweh so greatly that they started using Adonai.
Mm-hmm. And was that because they revered it too much, maybe, and didn't want to abuse its use? And yet, Christ said, "I came to make the name of my Father known to the Jews."
Indeed, to us all.
But obviously, at that time, mainly to the Jews, because he came to the lost sheep of Israel first. Yeah.
Yes, he came to the house of Israel first, Judah.
Yeah. But yeah, so, but to use his name today, absolutely. If Why not? Because there are many gods in the world, but there's only one true God.
Okay, let's say good evening to you, Liz. She says, sorry, I would not take the vaccine. Vaccines take a lot of trials before they are successful. Plus, we are not told the truth about what goes into them. These days, it's very hard to trust people. Okay, thanks for joining in, Liz. Peter says, do you think the election in America is like when Solomon was to become king and his brother tried to take the throne? There you go. I've landed you in it now,
Yeah.
Dr. Grady.
I do not believe that that's a direct analog because Trump's brother is not trying to take Trump's position. However, there is absolutely tremendous criminal activity going on, tremendous fraud. Every day we are learning more about it, particularly in a software called Dominion, which is easily manipulated, designed to actually determine the results of an election, not in an honest way, but in a dishonest way.
But haven't that been the case then for, you know, a lot of the past presidents that have been elected? Surely it would apply to them as well.
Well, first of all, it depends on the Dominion software as to where it was used, when it was used. For instance, our state of Texas tried it and said it was so bad they wouldn't use it. So each state has made a decision on this. So what you're going to find is that it's the majority of democratically run states that chose to use it in order to actually manipulate it and control the election results. It was actually refused by the Republican states in general because of its problems and wanting to have fair elections.
Okay.
The fact of the matter is there's tremendous fraud going on.
But how long has this software been in use? For how many years?
First developed in for Venezuelan use under Hugo Chavez.
And so that would be how many years ago?
Can't quite remember how long he's been dead, but it's certainly more than 10 years.
So the last two elections, it could have been rigged the same as what you're saying. It has been this time around.
Well, first of all, it was initially used in Venezuela. It's also been used in Cuba. Imagine that.
Mm.
And then it started becoming, according to designers from Canada, and then various states started to adopt it. So I wouldn't say the 16 election or the 12 election were necessarily important with that particular software. But this year it has become seriously a problem.
How are they ever going to get to the bottom of this? Does that mean that Trump's never going to actually concede defeat?
I think he has conceded defeat. He's actually now
No, he hasn't. No,
sorry?
no.
He
has not conceded at all.
Right,
So,
okay.
so what's going to happen, Grady, in your opinion?
We have a period right now of approximately 4 to 5 weeks when there's going to be a lot of lawsuits. And what we need to do is have hand counting, specifically in those areas where there are differences that can be highly argued.
Mm-hmm.
Wisconsin, obviously. Pennsylvania,
yeah.
Obviously. There are a couple of other states that fall in this category, such as Arizona,
mm-hmm.
possibly Nevada. But what we need is hand counts. We need real count where it's not manipulated, where they can't change. We know of situations where they actually stop in the middle of counting for what they call a software update.
Oh dear.
Now, the voting machine shouldn't be connected to the internet, and yet they were connected to the internet and updated, and believe it or not, Spain was involved.
Oh dear.
Don't blame me.
Well, the thing is, this kind of carries on that same theme. It says, please could you ask Dr. Grady if he thinks there's a chance that Mr. Trump could still be reinstated as president?
There is a possibility. I hope it will happen. I hope that God will perform a miracle, showing how much criminal activity is actually taking place. that we get accurate votes, and that he would in fact remain in office. But whether he remains in office or not, the big problem is we've got to have fair voting in the United States. The big issue is not whether he remains in office. The big issue is, are we going to get rid of this junk software? Are we going to prevent people from cheating? Are we going to prevent people who, through their own decision making, are making laws which are not consistent with the legislatures of the individual states they're in?
Do you think this is going to lead to backlash and perhaps more riots and more clashes between the Democrats and Republicans?
There's no doubt about it.
That's very
First
sad.
of all, first of all, the left is violent, period. Their objective to get something their way is to be violent. That's their methodology. And we see that with Antifa, Black Lives Matter, which is a Marxist organization and could care less about black lives. We see it in other organizations funded on the left. But when you have 72 million people voting for Mr. Trump, and they see that this election is being stolen because of things like faulty software that can be easily manipulated, with votes that suddenly show up in the middle of the night with only one check mark, and that's for Biden and nothing else. When signatures have not been checked on ballots that were mailed in, there's obvious fraud. Now, while the right doesn't believe in violence, there's going to be protest.
My goodness. Okay, next question.
Okay, here we go. Les says, how do you think the physical differs from the spiritual? Example, there was a legion of demons in one human being. Do different laws apply to the spiritual and the physical?
I think that's a good way of putting it. First of all, there's the natural laws that we're familiar with, such as gravity. But they don't apply to the supernatural. But now the word supernatural I'm using scientifically, I'm not using it theologically. What does supernatural mean? And if I were to use the word supersonic, an illustration, supersonic means something that goes faster than the speed of sound. It also means something that goes beyond the speed of sound. Now apply that to the word natural and supernatural. So there's the natural and there's that which goes beyond nature. And the laws are different. Natural and supernatural can exist in the same location without seeing each other.
Right, this is one. Norma's going to be very happy that I've got to hers, because she says, Grady, I've waited until you were live on TV. I think you are the most qualified to give an opinion about this news report. A news report on ITN News, which was one of our major news channels, reportedly said that the breaking ice in the Arctic is releasing methane into the air, causing damage to the Earth. Global warming is to blame. I think there's more to this story than the secular news is telling us.
Well, first of all, let's talk about the Arctic ice. Now, if you talk about the Arctic ice cap, we're not talking about necessarily the ice floating at the North Pole, which is fairly thin and would have very little in it to get into the atmosphere. Perhaps talking about the polar ice cap on Greenland, because that's the only place where you have a significant amount that might release anything. Now, the fact of the matter is that, and I love the way you pronounce it, methane. Of course, we pronounce it methane, but methane is what cows and people produce at both ends.
Oh.
I think I think in England it's lovely pronounced. But the fact of the matter is, there's very little stored in the ice that would get into the atmosphere. Much, much more comes from dry land sources and living organisms in the water. Because remember that when you digest food in a stomach of any organism without oxygen, you produce methane.
Right.
Can I just say, because we haven't got a strap with Dr. Grady's website on there, and just to remind you, it is creationworldview.org. creationworldview.org.
Thank you.
Okay. Digby says, could you ask Dr. Grady for an explanation? Grady, do you know what mRNA is? Have you heard of that? Apparently it's a new technology in medical science. How can we trust this will not be a DNA altering vaccine? Is that anything you've come across?
Well, first of all, if I'm correct, you said mRNA.
Yeah.
Now, of course, those initials could be used in 1,000 different ways, but I suspect you're talking about messenger RNA, which is spelled with a little m
That's
and a
it.
capital RNA.
That's it. That's exactly how they've spelt it.
And that's messenger.
Yeah.
That's messenger RNA. There are different kinds of RNA. RNA is very necessary, but it doesn't store the information. Basically, it transfers the information. DNA stores the information, so to speak. But there are different kinds of RNA, and messenger RNA is just that. It's messenger. It can carry things. And so that's just one of various ways in which you can manipulate the subcellular material. And so the question isn't really being asked correctly, so to speak. While that might be useful in manipulating things, perhaps it could be used with, again, immunity shots and that sort of thing. It can be also used for what, of course, many people are worried about, the manipulation of genetic information, transgenetic information. So I understand the concerns. In plants, it's really not much of a problem. In animals, it can't be a problem. In humans, I can tell you that there's many things I wouldn't want to try it for, but it may still be used for both beneficial and also deleterious reasons. Remember that technology is neutral. It's what you do with technology that makes it good or bad.
Right. Okay, we're in very quick. We've got just under 2 minutes.
Oh. Norma in Wales says, I've recently come across information of an alternative to the vaccine for COVID, and it's called ultraviolet blood irradiation. Has Dr. Grady an opinion on this? I'm considering taking part in tests. I'm 71 years old. You heard of that? UBI.
Well, of course, ultraviolet light will kill the virus. So I'm not quite sure what this lady's perhaps getting herself into.
Right. Okay.
You said UV, ultraviolet, what was it?
UBI, ultraviolet blood irradiation.
Yeah, you said blood irradiation.
Yes.
And so that's what concerns me, because ultraviolet light kills living organisms. You don't want to hit blood cells with ultraviolet light. You'll kill them.
Yeah.
Okay. Maggie,
Right.
sorry,
we're very...
Howard, I've got another 40 emails to
Sorry
go.
about
We're
that.
just getting into this.
I know. Well, when we have the opportunity to have Dr. Grady for 2 or 3 hours, then we can get all of them. But remember,